You know, when we think of ancient Greek literature, one name immediately pops up: Homer. The Iliad, the Odyssey, these massive foundational epics. We picture this almost legendary figure.
Right. Blind poet, the solitary genius. Yeah, that's the image.
Exactly, but what
Yeah.
if that image? Well, what if it's not the whole story? What if Homer isn't quite who or what we think?
hmm It's a really fascinating possibility.
So today, we're doing a deep dive into exactly that. Was Homer a real person, a single author, or is something else going on? We've looked at historical analysis, the poems themselves, even how Homer's talked about today.
And our mission, really, is to unpack the doubts, look at the evidence that makes scholars question the traditional view.
Right, because you might think you know Homer, maybe from school, but the reality, well, it might be a lot more complex and honestly, maybe even more interesting.
Absolutely. And this isn't some, fringe idea cooked up recently. The questions surrounding Homer, they go back centuries. Was it one person,
Hmm.
a group, maybe even just a name attached to the poems later?
Okay, so this debate has a long history. What were some of the first sort of alternative theories before modern scholarship really dug in?
Well, even early on, there were suggestions that maybe Homer wasn't an individual, but represented a kind of lineage or maybe a whole school of poets working in a similar tradition.
Like a family business of epic poetry.
Something like that, yeah.
Yeah.
And then much later, you get figures like Samuel Butler in the 19th century who look at the Odyssey and thought, this feels different. He actually proposed, quite radically for the time, that its author might have been a woman.
Wow, okay, that definitely challenges the old bearded man image.
It certainly does.
And there's even earlier stuff, right? Like Lucian, the satirist. He
Yeah.
wrote about meeting Homer.
Yeah, Lucian has this funny satirical piece where he claims to have met Homer's ghost, who then listed off several different potential birthplaces: Chios, Smyrna, Colophon, places on the west coast of modern Turkey.
He was joking, obviously, but
But the interesting thing is that general region, the coast of Asia Minor and the nearby islands, that's exactly where a lot of modern linguistic evidence points.
okay, now that's intriguing. So it's not just ancient gossip. The poems themselves have clues.
Precisely. The specific Greek dialect used in the Iliad and Odyssey, it's unique. It wasn't exactly the common spoken Greek of anywhere at the time they were likely written down, but its features line up really well with the Ionic and Aeolic dialects spoken in, you guessed it, ancient Ionia, that west coast of Turkey and the islands.
So the language itself feels like it comes from that specific area rather than, say, Athens or Sparta.
Much more so, yes. The grammar, the vocabulary, it has a distinct Ionian flavor, which makes it quite probable that the poems, at least in their formative stages, originated there.
And the ancients seemed to connect Homer to that region too, didn't they? There were stories about a poet from Chios. And didn't they have groups called the Homeridae?
That's right. The Homeridae, supposedly the children or followers of Homer, they were active by the 6th century BC, reciting the epics. And traditions linked Homer's birth specifically to Smyrna, modern Izmir, or his conception to Eos or Chaim.
So there's a strong early geographical link.
A very strong link. We even have tangible evidence, like a coin from the island of Eos dating to the 4th century BC, that depicts Homer. So that connection was established quite early on.
Okay, so geography points towards Ionia, but then the idea of a single real person named Homer starts to get fuzzy, right? When you look at the legends around him and the poems themselves.
Exactly. The figure of Homer becomes almost mythical. Even the name Homeros is ambiguous. It could mean hostage, but it also got associated with the word for blind. And that image, the blind bard, really took hold.
Which makes you immediately think of Demodocus in the Odyssey, the blind singer in the Phaeacian court.
It's almost certainly connected. Many scholars think Demodocus is sort of a reflection within the epic of how the epics themselves were created and transmitted.
Meaning through oral performance.
Precisely. Remember, these massive poems were likely composed and performed orally for centuries before widespread literacy took hold in Greece, maybe around the late 8th, early 7th century BC. This is probably when they were first written down.
So for hundreds of years, they just existed in memory and performance.
Largely, yes. And the blindness motif might symbolize that oral tradition, the idea of inner vision, memory, divine inspiration being more important than physical sight for a poet.
And you can see traces of that oral performance in the poems, can't you? The repetition.
Oh, absolutely. The repeated lines, the stock epithets,
Yeah.
Swift-footed Achilles, gray-eyed Athena, wise Odysseus Lot.
They come up again and again.
They do. And those aren't just like stylistic quirks. They were essential tools for oral poets, formulas. They helped the bard remember and structure the narrative during live performance. Their very presence screams oral tradition, not single author writing quietly.
Okay, so the style points to oral composition over a long time. What about the content? You mentioned things not lining up chronologically.
Right, that's another huge piece of the puzzle. The poems are often described as a chronological jumble.
How so? Give us an example.
Well, take the Judgment of Paris, the beauty contest that supposedly started the Trojan War. Homer barely mentions it, just alludes to it.
Implying the audience already knew the story?
Exactly, which suggests that core myth was probably already well established, maybe even older than the versions of the Iliad and Odyssey we have.
Okay, so some story elements seem older. What else?
Then there's the whole setting this heroic age. The poems describe heroes who are stronger, bigger, almost demigods. Many scholars link this description and some of the material culture mentioned to the late Bronze Age, maybe 1600 to 1200 BC.
Which is like 400 years before the poems were likely written down.
Right. And we have archaeological evidence from places like Mycenaean and Troy showing sophisticated civilizations existed back then. So the poems seem to preserve memories, perhaps distorted, of that much earlier period.
But it's not all Bronze Age stuff, is it?
No, definitely not. And that's the jumble. Mixed in, you find descriptions of things that seem much later, certain types of armor, social customs, references to, say, iron tools, or even building temples.
Temples. When did the Greeks start building those?
The earliest stone temples we know of really date to the 8th century BC, much closer to when the poems were likely recorded. So you have these layers echoes of the Bronze Age alongside details from the 8th or even 7th century BC.
So it's like archaeological layers within the text itself. Some deliberate archaism, maybe setting the war in the distant past, but also accumulated stuff from different times.
That's a great way to put it. It's a mix, preserving elements from different periods, partly by accident of the long transmission, partly perhaps by design to create that epic feel.
Okay, so we have the geography pointing to Ionia, we have the blind bard possibly symbolizing oral tradition, we have the repetitive formulas in the text, and we have this chronological jumble. It's quite a lot of evidence stacking up against the simple idea of one guy named Homer writing it all down.
It really is.
So where does that leave us? What's the sort of consensus view among scholars now, the Homeric question? What's the answer most experts lean towards?
Well, the dominant view in scholarship today is that Homer, as a single historical individual who authored both the Iliad and the Odyssey as we know them, is highly improbable.
So no one person.
Very unlikely. Instead, the poems are seen as the culmination of a long, rich oral tradition. Think centuries of nameless bards, performers, storytellers shaping and reshaping these epic tales.
A collective effort, almost?
Essentially, yes. There might have been a particularly brilliant bard, maybe in Ionia around the 8th century BC, who gave the stories a more defined shape, perhaps even based on existing cycles of songs. But the epics we read today are likely the product of generations of transmission and refinement.
And then someone eventually wrote them down, maybe tidied them up a bit.
That's part of the theory, too. When writing became more common, perhaps there was a person, or even a committee, who acted as an editor, compiling the best versions, standardizing the text, essentially creating the monumental epics we inherited.
So Homer becomes what? A symbol, a convenient name.
Kind of both. Maybe a name representing the entire tradition, or perhaps the name of a key figure in that tradition whose identity got conflated with the whole process over time. Some see Homer almost as the spirit of the epic tradition itself, a name given to these extraordinary poems that clearly evolved beyond any single creator.
It's a radically different picture, isn't it? Not one genius, but a whole culture's worth of storytelling condensed.
It is. And frankly, it makes the poems perhaps even more remarkable as crystallizations of centuries of cultural memory and artistic practice.
Okay, so the scholarly consensus leans heavily away from a single Homer. But walk into a bookstore, browse online, even visit a museum. You still mostly encounter Homer, the Greek poet.
Right.
Why does the traditional idea of a single author persist so strongly in mainstream culture?
That's the other fascinating part of the story. There's a real disconnect between the academic understanding and, well, how Homer is often presented to the general public.
Like in textbooks, I remember learning about the poet Homer.
Exactly. You'll often find school textbooks simply stating, Homer was a Greek poet who wrote the Iliad and the Odyssey. Maybe they mentioned he was thought to be blind. But the whole complex Homeric question, the strong possibility he wasn't one person, it's often just omitted.
Why do you think that is? Just lack of space? Or maybe the textbook authors aren't up on the latest scholarship?
It could be a mix of things. Simplicity is easier for textbooks. Tradition is powerful. And yes, maybe sometimes the nuance of the scholarly debate just doesn't filter down easily into those formats.
And what about more general history books, the kind you'd find in a regular bookstore?
It varies, but often you see a similar pattern. Some might playfully mention Homer, if he existed, or refer to the tradition of the blind poet. Others might briefly acknowledge there are questions about his authorship, but then just move on, still largely framing him as the author.
So they might nod to the doubt, but don't really explain why there's doubt.
Frequently, yes. You rarely get a full explanation of the linguistic evidence, the oral formulas, the chronological issues outside of more academic texts. It's easier to just stick with the established narrative.
What about the internet? If someone just Googles Homer Greek poet,
Go try it. Often the top results, places like biography.com or even the Wikipedia synopsis, will lead with Homer was the presumed author, or present him quite straightforwardly as a real figure in the initial summary.
even Wikipedia, I thought they'd be more nuanced.
The main articles often do get into the Homeric question if you read further down, but the quick summary, the bit that shows up in search results, it often simplifies. Encyclopedia Britannica might say something like, he probably existed, before delving into the complexities deeper in the article. Finding non-academic sources that really foreground the doubt is surprisingly difficult.
And museums, they have busts of Homer, right? How do they label them?
Ah, yes. The busts. Well, they're all imaginary portraits, created centuries after he supposedly lived. Take the Louvre, for instance. They have a famous marble bust. The description might say it's an imaginary portrait, but it still often refers to him as the poet who lived in the 8th century BCE.
So it acknowledges the portrait isn't real, but still presents the person as real.
Pretty much. Or look at the British Museum's website. If you search for Homer, you might eventually find pages discussing the authorship question. But if you just look at the description for, say, one of their Homer busts, it might state quite plainly that he lived around 750 to 700 BC and was the author of the epics, with no immediate caveat about his historicity.
So despite decades, even centuries, of scholarly work casting serious doubt, the mainstream image remains remarkably stable. Homer, the single author.
It's remarkably persistent. Maybe it's just a more satisfying story. The idea of a lone genius is often more appealing than a complex, centuries-long collaborative process.
So, circling back then, why does untangling this actually matter? Does it change how we should read the Iliad and the Odyssey if they weren't written by one specific guy?
I think it absolutely does, and in a good way. Understanding the strong possibility, the likelihood, that these poems are products of a long and evolving oral tradition gives you, I think, a much deeper appreciation for them.
How so?
Well, instead of just seeing them as this singular vision of one person, you start to see them as these incredible reservoirs of cultural memory, myths, values, and storytelling techniques passed down and refined over countless generations. They become testaments to the power of collective storytelling.
So it makes them more impressive, in a way, as a cultural achievement, rather than just an individual one.
Exactly. Recognizing that collaborative, evolving nature makes their coherence, their power, their survival even more astounding. It highlights the artistry of the oral tradition itself.
Okay, so let's quickly recap. The idea of a single historical Homer is seriously questioned by scholars for a lot of reasons.
Yeah, the geography and language point to Ionia. The poems themselves show strong signs of oral composition, like repetition and formulas. And they contain layers from different historical periods all jumbled together.
And the scholarly consensus leans towards Homer being more of a tradition, a culmination of centuries of bards, maybe with a key figure or editor involved late in the process.
That's the prevailing view, yes.
Yet the image of the single blind poet persists strongly in popular culture, textbooks, websites, museums.
It does, for various reasons: simplicity, tradition, maybe just the appeal of the lone genius narrative.
Right. So here's a final thought to leave everyone with. If the Iliad and the Odyssey truly are the result of a collective, multi-generational effort, what does that suggest about our whole concept of authorship and literary genius? Does it diminish the achievement, or does it perhaps elevate it, showing how a whole culture can collaboratively create something timeless? Does knowing who wrote it ultimately matter more than the incredible stories themselves?
That's the question, isn't it? Something to definitely ponder next time you encounter these amazing epics.